My name is Kenny Baldwin, and I'm humbled and honored to be with you today. Thank you, Pastor Mortensen, for the gracious invitation. I am so privileged to speak with those involved in Christian education. I, for one, am grateful for the role that Christian education has played and continues to play in my life and in the life of my family. And I'm forever indebted to those of you who will not just give your time, but give your life for this endeavor. This virtual conference is just a reminder of how unique and unprecedented 2020 has been. For all of us, it's been a huge adjustment. One that we don't even know when it will end. For me, it's been uniquely different. On March the 15th, I stood before the Crossroads Baptist Church and preached a message entitled, "My Times Are in Your Hand." It came from the life of David. David, in uncertain, unprecedented circumstances of his own, drew strength and confidence knowing that ultimately his existence, his livelihood, his safety, his life, his times were in God's hands. I shared this message specifically with our church because of this new virus that had surfaced. It was on the news and people were talking about it, and fear naturally erupted. And so God led me to that passage in the Psalms to challenge the people of God. Yes, be wise. Let's make sure we're safe. And even we as a church will make adjustments. But let's put our confidence and our trust in the God that we know is in control, because our times are in his hand. I even made a joke at the end of service because we didn't handshake and we didn't do a number of things that we normally would do by way of fellowship, just to take precautions. I put hand sanitizer on towards the end of the service as I meet my wife in the middle aisle and hold her hand and we walk out together, and I wanted to make sure she knew I was washing all that fellowship off that perhaps I had gotten from shaking hands before the service or anybody that I had been around. I wanted her to know that I was taking it seriously. And then we left church and we're getting ready for an evening service. Had a guest singer coming in to minister with us, had a wonderful service planned. But that afternoon, our governor reduced gatherings to nothing over 100 people. So we canceled the service. And I thought to myself, well, for a week or two, we'll have to cancel services. We'll get back into it and everything will be fine. I'm sure it will be. And then that night I started feeling a little different. I'm one who never gets sick. I never get the flu. I've never had to cancel a meeting because I wasn't feeling well, never missed church. I just don't have health issues, and I give God all the glory for that. But I wasn't feeling well that night. I wasn't feeling too great a couple days ago when I had been out of town preaching, but I was feeling better by Sunday, felt great that morning, but that night I just didn't feel well. I went downstairs, couldn't sleep, lay on the couch, and that morning I woke up, still wasn't feeling well. I lay on the couch all day long on Monday. On Tuesday morning, I got an appointment with my primary care doctor, went in. He sensed I had a fever, thought I had something viral. He said, go home, rest. I'll give you a prescription for pain because you have a headache. In a couple days, you should get better. And I was sure I was. I don't get sick. But the next morning I woke up and I felt something in my chest. I was sleeping on the couch just to make sure I was separated from the rest of the family, didn't want to spread anything to them. And I walked upstairs and I told my wife, I feel something funny. She said, are you having trouble breathing? I said, I'm not sure. I just feel something funny in my chest. She said, well, let's go to the hospital. We got in the car, we went to the hospital, we walked in. I walked in the back in the emergency room where I was by myself. They ran an x-ray. I was there for a little bit. They came back and told me, looks like you have pneumonia. We're going to start you on a prescription, give you one here today. You go fill it, you do it for the next 4 or 5 days, and it should be able to handle your pneumonia. Of course, if you have any issues and it gets worse, please feel free to come back here. I wasn't tested for the virus. I did not necessarily have a bad fever. I had not been out of the country those early forms of criteria. I didn't meet them, so they felt like this prescription would handle it. I got back home, and immediately upon arriving back home, I started to feel worse. I started shaking, and there were chills, and every part of my body started hurting. And I told my wife maybe I need to get in a warm bath to try to get my body warmed up from being chilled so much. And when I did get in the bath just for a little bit, I got so weak I couldn't even get out. She had to help me out, and I had no energy, no strength. I lay down on the bed. She said, "Honey, you can't lay down. You seem like you're getting weaker." And she saw that my breathing was getting more labored. She said, "You think you need to go back to the hospital?" I said, "Well, let me just lay here for a while and maybe I'll get better." And she said, "No, I think you need to go back to the hospital." And so we got back in the car. I staggered my way there. We got back to the hospital. I did the best I could to walk inside, leaned up against the wall, eventually sat down in a chair. They ran my temperature and I was 105. I told them I'd been there early. They rushed me to the back. This time, after being in the doctor a day before, in the emergency room that morning, and in a clinic several days before, they finally decided to test me. They ran x-rays again, and the doctor told me, "Your lungs were worse in a couple hours, like it takes most to worsen in several days." They tested me for the virus, and then they started putting stickers up on the door. They came in the room with gowns on, with visors on, with gloves on. They looked at my wife and said, "You need to leave now." The emergency room doctor said it will take a couple days to get the results back. But because of how your scans look and because of your condition, I really believe you have the virus. In my mind, I thought, no, not me. I'll bounce out of this. I'll get better in a couple days. The results will come back. I'll be back home. My wife left out of there. She kissed me goodbye. She walked away. I waved at her. And then they admitted me into the hospital. They rolled me on this bed into this room. It seemed huge, quiet, isolated. And then they put me in this room and they said, "You'll be isolated in a room. Every 4 hours, we will do your vitals. We'll give you your medications. We will check on you, but we will be gowned up. We will spend as little time as possible in the room. And we will try not to come in unless absolutely necessary in between those 4 hours, because they were trying to protect themselves." And I found out that for the next 10 days, I would experience a trial and a crisis like nothing I'd ever experienced. No visitors, no family. I left the house that morning thinking I'd be back. I'd see my children. I'd be back in church in a few days or at least a week. Thinking that whatever it was, medicine would solve it and life would go back to normal. And yet I woke up the next morning with every fiber in my being hurting. My head hurt. My back hurt. It felt like someone took a belt and tied it around my chest. I'm a talker. I'm a preacher. This is what I do for a living. But I had to gasp between every single breath. My temperature hovered around 103, 104. I was taking medicine every 4 hours and it would not break. I was in so much pain. I could not sleep. I could not eat. I developed more symptoms. My x-rays worsened. I was met every morning around 8:30 by a set of 3 different doctors. The infectious disease doctor, the internal medicine doctor, and the pulmonary doctor. They looked at me and I looked at them, delirious and in pain, saying, "We're watching you very closely. You're going to get really worse or you're going to get better, and we don't know." I remember dialing my wife up on FaceTime and looking at her. I remember seeing my children on the video and they're breaking down and crying. And I remember thinking, Lord, how did I get here? I was just preaching about this virus, trying to help our church. I'm supposed to be helping them. Surely this is not happening. 2 days later, they called me and said, your tests have been confirmed. You have COVID-19. You've tested positive. They called my wife while she was at the drugstore picking up something for me. As she tells me, her whole world went silent. She got in the car, tuned everything out, said, God, I'm going to have to silence the noise, hear from you, and be what I need to be for my husband and for my children during this time. She broke down and cried and rode back to the house, began to share the news with my children. We shared it with my family. And I saw a grace come over her that I had never seen on her before. I remember lying in the hospital, couldn't eat. I saw food and it made me sick, and I was sick stomach and all of these other symptoms of hives and diarrhea and pain and fever and chills were coming over me. And I remember trying to walk 5 steps to the bathroom and gasping and sitting down and taking 15 minutes to try to regather myself to walk just 3 to 5 steps back to the bed. And I remember shaking and waiting for the nurse to come in to bring the medication. She could not bring it in closer to 4 hours. I had to wait. And I remember calling my wife and looking at her, and she'd say, you're waiting for medication to kick in again, aren't you? And I remember just looking at her, and she would talk to me and say, you're going to be okay. And she'd sing to me, or she'd just say, it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. And she'd just stare at me because I couldn't get enough strength to talk. And she'd just watch me. And she'd just smile. And she'd say, you look so handsome. And I remember saying to her, you're lying to me. I don't look handsome. She said, yes, you do. And I remember saying to her, honey, just pray that I get better. Pray that I get better. I didn't even want to look at the children to scare them, because the couple times I'd seen them, they were so overwhelmed with grief, having never seen me feel that way. I remember talking to my wife in the hospital about death. I remember talking to her about the possibility. She looked at me and I looked at her. And I said, we're not going to talk about it. It's in the Lord's hands, but I know you're thinking about it. I am too. I remember FaceTiming my parents every morning after the doctors came in. I remember when the doctor said, you've gotten worse. I remember when the doctor said, I can't tell you if you're going to get better. I said, well, can't you give me some kind of news? He said, you're a man of faith, aren't you? You better hope for that. I remember when the oxygen dropped and they came in with oxygen in my nose, and the doctor walked in and said, you're getting worse. We need to take you down to intensive care and put you on a ventilator. And I've got young men your age there, and they got 50% chance of living. And I remember looking at the doctor and said, doctor, please let me breathe into this spirometer and help build up my lungs. Please, doctor, don't take me down there. And I remember him saying, I'm going to give you a chance, but if you get any worse, I'm going to take you down there. And I remember friends all over the country. I remember missionaries all over the world. I remember my dad lying on his face all night long praying for a breakthrough. I remember my siblings begging God to come through. I remember people fasting and praying. I remember my wife saying, we need God, and sending it out to people, and our deacons updating our church and our staff, and special friends that were there for me, and people all over that I'm still finding out praying for me that we need a breakthrough. We need a breakthrough. And I remember just lying in that hospital bed thinking, God, just give me a chance. Just give me a chance. And as the news was coming on, and people, if you would, that were getting this virus and getting worse, and they didn't have much information, and the doctors had never seen anything like this, and it was novel, and they were trying stuff, and they were telling us about new medicine that were coming out, and other people were hearing stuff on the news, and people didn't know what to believe. And I remember just saying, God, you're all I have, and you're all I need. I remember the first day my fever broke. I remember the doctor saying there's some improvement, but you're not out the woods, because what we're seeing is people get better and then get worse again. And I remember praying, and I remember thinking, I've never felt anything like this in my life. I remember when it Got a little better the next day. And yet the oxygen got worse. And I thought one thing's getting better and one thing's getting worse. And I remember my wife saying, you're going to get better. You're going to come out of this. And after 10 days of that, and after moments when I didn't know if I was going to make it, and after looking at a doctor who thought, you're going down and you're going down fast, I remember rolling out of that hospital. I remember being cleared to go. And I remember the nurse and someone else pushing me outside that hospital where no one was allowed to enter. And I remember seeing my wife in person for the first time in 10 days. And I remember getting in that car and pulling up to my house. And I remember my children coming out. And I remember embracing Kevin and Kobe and Carmen and Chloe and Deontay, and staggering into that house and sitting down on my steps. And I remember going upstairs and 3 of them having to literally get me up the steps. 25 pounds lighter, a different person, but alive. The next several weeks, I'd be on the news doing interviews. I had the opportunity to share my testimony. I experienced life like I never knew it. I couldn't even get out to bed much without leaning on the wall. A bunch of memories are gone. Brain fog, chest tightness, limb pain, over 6 months after this, is still here. But I'm alive. And I learned something about God. I knew he was real. I knew he was faithful. But I learned his faithfulness in a crisis I had never faced before. I learned that he had not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. I learned that in my weakness, he is strong. I learned that at my lowest point, he was lifted up the highest. I learned that he didn't need me. I learned that in the moments in my life when I was vibrant, I was itinerant, I was traveling 50, 60 places a year. I was seemingly invincible, jumping off the platform, preaching for an hour and wishing I could preach again after I finished. I learned that my impact was lesser when I was stronger than it was when I was weaker, because it was all about God. I learned how valuable my wife was and my family. I learned how valuable godly parents and godly siblings and their families were. I learned how special my children were. I learned how precious my church was. I learned how real my friends were. I learned that the power of prayer works. I learned how blessed I am to pastor the greatest people in the world. And I learned how loved and appreciated I was. I learned how much of a liar the devil is, and how doubt and dismay and disillusionment and despair and distress and depression are tools that he uses to destroy people. But I learned that greater is he that is in us than he that is in the world. I'm still learning. I'm learning patience. I just knew I'd be back to 100% by now. And I'm still trying to find my way there. But I've learned something. If I never get back to where I was, I'm better for it. Because God has taught me his strength is perfect. And I've asked him to let my life do these 2 things: glorify him and impact others. That's my COVID testimony. There's so much more I could say. But I hope it's a blessing to you wherever you are in your life today. God is real. Yeah. The virus is real. Sin is real. The devil is real. Trials are real. Difficulties are real. Listen to me. All of this stuff is real. But God is real. And the significance of his realness is that he's bigger than all that stuff. And he has used that in my life to teach me some things about him, about me, about others, and about life that I never learned before. maybe he's using your trial to do the same.